So plants and animals change over time. And Darwin showed how the changes might be determined by a species' ability to fit within a specific environment. As environment changed, so did species. We'll call this adaptation. In fact, plants have changed and adapted to figuring out how to survive in just about every environment or biome on the planet. Since plants can't move or move very fast, at least, they had to learn to adapt. And remember, adaptation is the fourth part of natural selection. And of course, adaptation is only effective if the genes that allowed the adaptation to be successful are passed on to the next generation. This process took a long, long time. Let's take a closer look how algae emerged and created lichens, which created mosses, which created pine trees, which created flowering plants over the process of evolution. The leap from the ocean to land plants was a huge evolutionary step that was likely made when algae merged with a fungus to produce the more complex organism we call a lichen. Lichens evolved over time into more complex organisms still. On this rock, you can see both plants, the simpler lichen, the gray-green organism, and the more complex organism, the moss, which is a little bit darker green and has more structure to it. And on this rock, we see even more complex organisms, both the moss in the corner here, as well as some more complex organisms we'll call ferns with true leaves. And eventually, even more complex plants emerged. These gymnosperms, or seed-bearing plants, with ovules on the edge of an open cone-like structure, rather than inside an ovary. The term gymno means naked, and these are naked seeds. That is, they don't form inside of a fruit. Pine trees are indeed an ancient form of tree species. Angiosperms are still more complex organisms in which a seed forms within a fruit. This is a fairly specialized structure and came along more recently than the pine trees. So plants have changed over time, a very long time. It is generally believed these changes were adaptations to some form of stress, perhaps caused by changing environment or by overpopulation, as Darwin proposed. Without adaptations, plants don't survive. Here are some really useful adaptations to a dry environment that allow plants to survive in a desert. The thin pine needles that don't fall off in the winter allow the tree here, to shed its snow during a heavy snow load in the north. Pine needles are also water tolerant and can survive heavy winds. Here's few more really interesting adaptations. Of course, you got tendrils that allow a plant to climb up, move towards the sun, and you've got water leaves that float on the surface of the water. You've got the African violet that captures insects, and a pitcher plant that also captures insects. In soils with poor nitrogen, the Venus flytrap can get all the nitrogen it needs by eating insects, or in this case, a frog. And here are some less gruesome plant adaptations. More plant adaptations to the environment. Can you imagine what would happen if berry fruits were tasty before they were ripe? The seeds would not get dispersed because animals would eat them before the seeds were mature and ready to be distributed throughout the environment. Pollination is a specialized process that often includes a relationship with another organism, like the birds and the bees. Some flowers adapt their color and their smell to allow insect pollination. When two organisms change over time to adapt to each other, we call this coevolution. As flowers changed over time, so did the bees. So plants and animals change over time. We call this evolution.